The Declaration of Independence contains these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, we should appreciate and recognize that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these words are written down, or they are written in a particular and logical order. For example, it is very, very difficult to have a pursuit of happiness if you do not have liberty. And it is very difficult to have a pursuit of happiness if you are not alive. Life must come first. Life, then liberty, and then the pursuit of happiness. So you as Christians, when we look at these words, we recognize that there's much to be said for them, and we certainly agree with the first one, which is that life must come first. And so today, as I was trying to think, what should I speak on as we have the topic of Christian in America, I thought, let's take at some of these foundational words in a foundational document, the Declaration of Independence, and let's look at least the first one. Let's look at the word life. Life is a big issue here in the United States. It is, and you say, well, it's a big issue everywhere. But in particular, it came to the forefront because in June of this year, June of 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States reversed the 1973 ruling of Roe versus Wade. And in Roe versus Wade, that particular ruling from the Supreme Court back in 1973 legalized abortion within the United States. With the new ruling, which took place in June of 2022, what we have is that the responsibility for laws went back to the states. And so now each state has the right and responsibility to regulate abortion within its own borders. The result of this is each state makes laws regarding children in the womb. Now, as I say the word children in the womb, even that wording is controversial in today's society. For many people say, well, it's not a child until that child is actually birthed. There is a downplaying of children in the womb. So much so that we even had a candidate for the state of Georgia for the governorship saying that the concept of a fetal heartbeat is a false and made-up thing, and that it is done to basically force women to have children. This was said by Stacey Abrams down in Georgia. I can give you the quote in full if you'd like that later on. So as we look at this, obviously we understand that children are in the womb. Children are there. They are not just a clump of cells, but they are actual children. I thought what we would do today is we'd look at the concept of life. And yes, we'll look at the concept of abortion and the value of children, but life is a bigger issue than just children and abortion, but it spans, obviously, one's whole life. So we will look more than just at abortion, but we will start there. And we will start at God, or our God, the God of beginnings. If I go to and visit you in the hospital, now that COVID is mostly done with, although not completely, and if I happen to have the opportunity to visit you in the hospital after you've had a child, almost surely I will open up my Bible and we will turn to Psalm 127. And in Psalm 127, we'll read verses 3 through 5. I remember when Lisa and I, we had our first son, Thad, and I remember our pastor, Tom Roman, came and he opened up his Bible and he turned to Psalm 127 and we read verses 3 through 5. And these are great words to read, exciting words to read, beautiful words to read. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. And what we see here is we see the concept of children being a blessing from God. Now, I don't know, at this particular time in America, I still think that children, even by people who would be, for example, pro-abortion, I still think that all people would say, yes, children are a blessing from God. Well, hold on a second. There are children who are fussy. Yeah, there's children which scream, there's children which cause grief, there's children which are difficult. But when all is said and done, and especially in retrospect, once you get past the fussiness and the screaming, and sometimes that takes a couple of years, You get to go ahead and say, yes, yes, I agree with the psalmist. Children are a blessing from the Lord. But there will be those who will argue, they say, well, yes, but those are children who are born, so therefore that does not necessarily apply. So let's look at a few other areas. If we go to the book of Jeremiah, the first chapter of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah, he is a prophet who serves for a very long time. And God calls Jeremiah when he is relatively young. We don't know exactly what age, but let's say late teens, maybe early 20s. And God calls to Jeremiah, and he speaks to him, and Jeremiah is going to be called as a prophet. In Jeremiah chapter 1, pick it up in verse 4. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, okay, so this is Jeremiah writing about God's call to him. And this is what God said to him: before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And what is interesting for us with the Hebrew word here for to know, it is the word yada. What we have here is the idea of I know. And some people say, yeah, okay, great. God had a mental cognition. He understood who Jeremiah was. But the word to know is more than simply a knowledge thereof, but rather it is the idea of caring. It is the idea of intimacy. It is used, for example, in a slightly different way. For example, and Adam knew his wife, okay? And so in that sense, there's intimacy, there's caring. That's how the word should be understood. Before I formed you, Jeremiah, in the womb, I knew you. I cared for you. You were special to me. That's the idea here. And before you were born, I consecrated. That is, I set you aside. I had plans for you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Isn't this interesting to us that God has a plan, ladies and gentlemen, not just for those of us who are walking on our own 2 feet, but for those who are still within their mother's womb. God has a plan. God is the author of life. God is the one who is from the beginning. And because he's from the beginning, he has ownership of it. We can scoot over to Psalm 139, a well-known psalm, of course. Psalm 139 and verses 13 through 16. And our psalmist writes, for you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. And once again, we have a God who understands what the child is like within the womb. God understands the plans that he has for mankind, for womankind, for humankind, however you would like to say it. God has a plan. Life is important. In Exodus chapter 21, staying in the Old Testament, is a passage which is somewhat difficult, but we'll turn there. In Exodus chapter 1, there is various laws given to the nation of Israel, but we certainly, within this, get an expression of God's value of life, even life within the womb. In Exodus chapter 21, in verses 22 through 24, it picks up a situation where an expectant mother is hit, and therefore she has a child. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose upon him, and he shall pay as the judgment determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay for life for life. And what we see here, it's interesting. Some people will argue, they say, well, what the life here is, what happens if the woman goes into a premature pregnancy or premature delivery and she dies, and therefore she dies, and therefore it affects its life for life. That is the mother's life for the man has to sacrifice his life for the mother's life. But I think the better understanding here is that the child that is born actually, even here we have the concept of life for life. Life is so precious that it must be protected by life. Let's skip to the New Testament, though. In the New Testament, we get a very, very interesting passage, and I think I would have to say it's unique. Well, I know it's unique. Go to the book of Luke. In Luke, we have communication between 2 children in the womb. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 41, I'll pick it up in verse 39, better for context. What we have here is Mary has just been told that she will conceive. And we're told in verse 39, in those days Mary, that is Mary the mother of Jesus, in those days Mary arose and went with haste to the hill country, to the town of in the town of Judah. And she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the baby, that is, the baby here is John the Baptist, by the way, the baby leaped in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she exclaimed with a loud cry, Blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her from the Lord. What a marvelous thing here, what we have here, is we have Jesus Christ referred to as a person. We have John the Baptist, who is jumping for joy literally within the womb of his mother. Now, there could be those, I suppose, they could say, well, that's Jesus and that's John the Baptist, so that's exceptional. But I prefer to go ahead and say that this is a description of life within the womb. I don't want to make excuses for death. I would prefer to err upon the side of life. Abortion is very, very hard in the United States because people will look at the worst case situations and they say, what happens, however, when a woman unfortunately, tragically, criminally is attacked, assaulted, she is raped, and she becomes pregnant at that particular time. She has done nothing wrong. It's not her fault, but now she has been put into a situation which she did not ask for. It happens. This is a terrible thing. Rapists, quite frankly, well, if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 22, rapists were to be stoned most of the time. I'm okay with that. But we don't do that too much. We don't do too much forced castration anymore, but I think that might have some merit too, but maybe I'm going off a little bit too far. All right. What we have, though, is what we should understand is that women should be protected, and that should not happen. There should be protection of that. But every once in a while, a child is conceived because of this situation. And we must ask the question, well, what then? Are we to go ahead and to have the child terminated because of the sins of an assaulter? I leave that question out to you to ponder, because many people will say, well, we've got you, Christian. That's a hard question for you. But I think that it's somewhat of it's a legitimate question, but I think, once again, we have to not make public policy, or we should not be making public policy based upon the absolute worst-case situations. The reality is that when you look at the statistic, most abortions take place not because of rape and not because of incest, but because of convenience. There are those that say, wait a second, it's the woman's body, and so therefore, since it's her body, we need to leave her alone. I have a couple of quotes. If you got one of the little pamphlets, I put most of the bigger quotes in there for you, so that they're for your reference, if you'd like. But we have an interesting quote from Norman Geisler, and he writes this. He says, an unborn child is not an extension of its mother. By the second month of a pregnancy, a child has its own brain waves, its own heartbeat, blood of its own type, its own fingerprints, nose, eyes, ears. An unborn child is no more part of its mother than a test tube baby is part of a petri dish. C. Everett Koop, who once upon a time was the Surgeon General for the United States, he argues this. He says, I do not know anyone among my medical conferees, no matter how pro-abortion he might be, or she, and that's the case may be, by the way, who would kill a newborn baby the minute he was born. My question is this, would you kill this infant a minute before he was born, or a minute before that, or a minute before that? At what minute can one consider life to be worthless, and the next minute consider the same life to be precious? So much for logic. The tragic thing that we see nowadays, however, is that more and more we are seeing people who look at C. Everett Koop and say, well, actually, we will say that you can have abortion even to the point of delivery. There's actually talk about some people saying, well, perhaps we can even do that after delivery. If you're looking for horrific scenes within the Old Testament, and there's lots of them, Um, let's turn to one, because you're like, let's have something happy. So let's go to horrific things. In 2 Kings chapter 8, we have here Elisha. Elisha is having a vision. The Syrian king, I believe it is. Yes. In 2 Kings chapter 8, and verse 11. In Hazael, king out of Damascus, Hazael says, "Why does my Lord weep?" And he answered, now this is Elisha speaking, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young men with the sword, and dash into pieces their little ones." And notice this here, "and rip open their pregnant women." And we look at this and we say, oh my goodness, how terrible. And it's designed, frankly, to be terrible, because this is considered the epitome of something which is horrific. And yet what we have, unfortunately, in the United States of America and in many countries around the world is that people are voluntarily allowing this to happen to their own children. You can go to, and I mistyped it, by the way, it's Hosea chapter 13 and verse 16, but you see the same type of thing which is written. We won't turn there for time's sake today. Now, some of you are saying, well, okay, Frank, great, Pastor, you have to speak on abortion every once in a while, so you've done your job, go ahead and move on. But you're saying, but I'm not in the position of having an unwanted child, and I don't know anybody who has an unwanted child, and I don't, let's move on, because the whole abortion conversation is uncomfortable for me. But I'm not talking just about abortion, I'm talking about life. I'm talking about life, and life has a beginning, and life also has an end. And our God is the God both of the beginnings, and our God is the God of ends as well. If our society is not one which will protect the very young, be very, very careful, because it's not going to be very excited about protecting the very, very old and disabled either. And we see that. We see that more and more there is a move towards euthanasia. There's more and more a move towards mercy killing. There's more and more a move towards getting rid of people which are not deemed worthy of life. If you're only valuable because of what you can do, your utility, then once your utility comes to an end, you are worthless. You are less than human. You are no longer valuable. I hope none of you expects to retire. If you're retired and not doing a whole lot, perhaps people might consider you not valuable. On July 14th, 1933, the German government instituted the law of prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases. This called for the sterilization of all people who suffered from diseases considered hereditary, including mental illness, learning disabilities, physical deformities, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, and severe alcoholism. Think for a moment of the people that you know who have these things. With the law's passage, the Third Reich also stepped up its propaganda against the disabled, regularly labeling them life unworthy of life. This is a democratic first world country. Or useless eaters, and highlighted their burden upon society. If we as a society say, well, life at the beginning is unimportant, I can tell you this right now, that life at the end also will be considered unimportant. Yet that is not God's opinion of things. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, we see here, even in the creation, we see that mankind, male and female, are created in the image of God. So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And my understanding of the image of God is this, is that we as whole human beings, that is both spiritual and physical beings, are walking representatives of the God who created us. As walking representatives of our God, we are to multiply and to cover the earth and to fill the earth, so that God's glory may be seen throughout the whole of the earth. I never ever see within Scripture God's concern about overpopulation, by the way. Never once. Never once. What God wants is he wants little flags known as human beings all around the globe. And he wants those to represent him. Male and female, women are the image of God just as men are the image of God. Equal in value. Women are not inferior to men. They are of equal value. And because they are image of God, because we are all the image of God, because that's the case, we have value. And when we attack the image of God, it is as if we are attacking the flag of God. If someone were to take a look at a flag and they were to go ahead and to burn the flag, you would say that is an attack upon the country. When somebody attacks a human being, that is an attack upon God himself. We see this concept in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. This is after the fall. This is after the flood. All of this, we see here that the image of God theology continues after the fall, after the flood. And we see in chapter 9 and verse 6 that God calls for extreme consequences for those who will attack human beings. They themselves also must be put to death, for they have done something so egregious. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. If a man attacks another man so that he kills him, that's like an attack upon God, and God calls upon humanity to put that person to death because they are so out of control. That's what you have here. Our God is a God of life. Our God is a God of beginnings. Our God is the God who is there at the end. And if this is so, then we need to be a people who protect life, who value life. It means that God at the beginning, God at the end, and God's people in between. How do we live in this world with life and death type of situations? I'm here to tell you that we are here to protect the weak. One of the things which we are called to do is to protect those who are most vulnerable. Why? Because those who are strong in theory can take care of themselves, but we are to take care of those who are most vulnerable. Let's go to another passage in the Old Testament. We look at the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 1, there is genocide being described. And we have here Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has decided that the Israelites who are living within Egypt, they are too numerous, and so therefore they need to be done away with. And he wants the male children to be killed. Or let's pick it up in verse 15, Exodus 1:15. Then the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill it, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. You know, we can add these midwives to the women. We talked about a little bit about civil disobedience last week. When there are immoral laws and the government says do them, sometimes you have to disobey. And we looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were told to worship a false god, and they did not. We looked at Daniel, who was told, do not pray, but he still did. We look at John and Peter, who were told, do not preach in the name of Jesus Christ, but they did. We see this concept of civil disobedience. You could take the example of Esther, who was told, don't go before the king or you might die, but she did because it had to be done. We can look at these women here who did not obey an immoral law, and God blessed them because of it. God values life. How do we handle this, folks? What do we do, though, in a society which more and more does not? Well, on a practical level, we need to be a people of prayer, first and foremost. We need to be a people of support. When you know a woman who has a pregnancy which was not her plan, be a counselor to her. Be compassionate to her. Find out what she needs for support. When you have people who are at the end of life, you need to be a person who is there to be a help, to be an ear, to listen, to take care of them, to have compassion. With children who are unwanted, we need to look at adoption. We need to look at fostering. For the elderly who are sometimes forgotten, we need to have nursing home ministries. We need to have memory care ministries. You know, our church used to have a pretty good memory care ministry for a number of years, and then COVID happened. And all of a sudden, all the doors were shut. One of the reasons why I thought this was a great ministry, even though it was a difficult ministry, it was because we were showing in a practical way that we value people, even though the rest of the world may not. We need to advocate respect for all ages. We live in a youth culture. Today's world, if you're not, a certain demographic, you're not important. That's not biblical teaching. If we're concerned about unwanted pregnancies, then we need to make sure that we're teaching our young women and our young men about sexual integrity and sexual purity. A lot of problems take care of themselves when people are behaving themselves sexually. We need to remember to be teachers of forgiveness. For there are a lot of women under undue pressure, undue stress, have had abortions, for example. And the last thing that we need to do is go ahead and vilify them so much so that they want to go ahead and run away from the church. We need to let them understand that there is forgiveness in Jesus Christ. We need to teach and preach and tell people, you know what, we still love you, and Jesus Christ can take care of that. I believe that oftentimes women who have had abortions and who have not seen any type of forgiveness decide to become great proponents for abortion because they need to justify the actions which they already committed. And they need to do something to assuage their guilt. We, ladies and gentlemen, need to go ahead and to offer grace, forgiveness, acceptance, and rally around these people that they might become the great advocates against the ending of life. We need to be willing to vote on these issues. Now, I find sometimes when we talk about abortion, by the way, I find that men get very, very uncomfortable. Men sometimes say, well, that's kind of a woman's issue. Well, number one, gentlemen, you can't have an unwanted pregnancy without you, okay? All right. But number two, it's not just a woman's issue, it's a men's issue. Gentlemen, sometimes when you think that you are strong, I'm strong and I'll be okay and I don't have to worry about a whole lot. One day you will not be strong. One day you will not be able to care for yourself. One day people will no longer think that you are a strong, dangerous man, and they will see you as weak and frail and useless and a consumer of the resources of this world. We don't need you so much anymore. And when you find yourself in that situation, my hope is that you can say, well, I have strived all my life for a society and a culture which values life. Because if you have not, they will not value your life in the end. The Declaration of Independence has some interesting words: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we agree with much of this. And I agree very much with the logical order: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You can't have happiness if you're dead. You can't have liberty if you're dead. Life must come first. As Christians in America, we must promote life. We must protect life. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the greatest of these is life.